Welcome to our review on geography, empires, and the world in 1500 AD. Seems like a lot of topics to cover, but everything relates back to geography. So the first thing that it's important that you know is your continents and oceans. And you need to be able to identify, like if there's a question that maybe says in Africa or in Asia, that you at least know kind of what part of the world that you're talking about. Sometimes you could even have a section colored in, and it might even have a question about the continent. But knowing your continents and oceans is a basic thing that you definitely need to know. Not only do you be able to know like what the world looks like, but often most everything that we have is focused on the Eastern Hemisphere. So we go from looking at the world to looking at just this half of the world. And so as we're looking at the Eastern Hemisphere, countries that we really should focus on here in India, China, and then there's going to be questions about Europe. You will have maybe a question or two about Africa, but most of the questions that we will have will focus on Europe, and then most of all India, China, and Japan. So here's India. So you need to be able to locate India if we're looking at any of these maps. So here's India. So look for that peninsula. Here's India. And then, of course, here's India kind of up close. And so that's a country where we know they ask about the religion, that's where Hinduism is today, where Hinduism started. It's also where Buddhism started. It's also where the Mughal Empire was. So there's a lot of important things that happen in India. They could even ask you a question that was something like, in which country did Gandhi lead his people to independence from Great Britain? And then you would try to identify India on a map. So as we're looking at our maps, time periods are very important. So one of the ways that you can kind of tell when something is often looking at Germany. Like, what is the size of Germany? So here we're looking at, this is a very large Germany. This is actually the Holy Roman Empire. It isn't even Germany yet. So this map is from 1500 AD when the course begins. And so another way you can look at, so like this is only England. Do you see this line here? It's because they haven't taken Scotland yet. So it's still just England. Also notice here on Italy, how Italy is broken up into smaller states. That's because it hasn't been unified yet. You can also see, you still see the Ottoman Empire, like you're not seeing countries here. So you know if it's the Ottoman Empire is still there, that it's at least before World War I. And then, of course, Germany doesn't get founded until right before, about 50 years before World War I. So this course starts in 1500 AD, and it's important to know the empires. And so this just kind of goes over your empires. The Mayans, we always are talking about, remember Amy with an I, Aztec, Maya, Inca. The Mayans aren't going to be so important. It's really the Aztecs and the Incas that are the most important to remember. They like to ask you about the Incas. They like to ask you about the people group who lived here along the Andes Mountains. Remember that both the Incas and the Aztecs were conquered by Spanish conquistadors. What they like to do with this SOL is they like to cover several things. They're asking you geography. They're asking you to identify an empire, but they're also then maybe tying in exploration or another SOL. Because remember, the SOL test is only 60 questions, so they're trying to ask as many things as they can in kind of one question. So from there, you might have a question about like the Songhai Empire. I think you're most likely, though, to be asked about the Ottoman Empire, or say the Mughal Empire, China possibly. So this is the Persian Empire, which is present-day Iran. I don't think you'll be likely to be asked about that. So let's look at the empires that we are likely to be asked about. And so Ottoman Empire, you're definitely going to see at least one question about the Ottoman Empire. They love to put a map of the Ottoman Empire. It covers 3 continents because it covers Europe, Asia, and Africa. And this is the Ottoman Empire at its height. The Ottoman Empire started in Turkey, and the capital is Istanbul. Remember, it's Istanbul, not Constantinople. They traded coffee and ceramics. You just kind of remember those C's. Think about that crescent, moon, and star. And they unified their people through Islam and Arabic. Remember that the people group that they were ruling were lots of different religions, and they made you have a special tax if you weren't Muslim. So a lot of people actually converted to Islam because they didn't want to pay the tax. Along the same time period was also the Mughal Empire. This is the Mughal Empire at its height between the yellow and the orange. So they're located in India. They traded textiles and jewels, or gems if you prefer. Spices would also be in this area of the world. Remember that the Indians are predominantly Hindu, but when the Mughals come in, the Mughals are a Mongol people, they bring Islam with them, even though the majority of people will still be Hindu, which is why when Gandhi leads India to independence and they split up into two countries, they split up into Pakistan, which is here. Pakistan is the Muslim majority part of the country, and then India is the Hindu majority. I mean, even today in India, 20% of the people in India today are Muslim. So you need to be able to recognize these empires if we're looking at, say, a zoomed in map like this, or if we're looking at a zoomed out map like this. And so here's that same Ottoman Empire we looked at and that same Mughal Empire. This is just looking at a different map. So you want to look for features that will help you to identify. So whenever I'm looking for the Ottoman Empire, I'm looking at Turkey. I'm trying to see, is Turkey here? The Black Sea, which looks like the side of a tennis shoe. I'm looking for India. I'm looking for this point here. Some people call Sri Lanka the teardrop of India because it looks like it's kind of a small, like little teardrop that's coming off of the country. So those were gunpowder empires. At the same time period, we also have China and Japan. So in China, remember, is the start of the Silk Road, and they're going to trade with Europe. They're going to trade silk, porcelain, tea, paper, gunpowder, compass, and it goes across Asia. They also were very fearful for foreign influence, and so they're going to set up enclaves, enclosures, like cities like Macau. So Macau is specifically to trade with Portugal. And so they set up these little spheres, these little enclaves, and then foreigners couldn't go anywhere else. So we move from China to Japan, its neighbor. So we have China here, and then the Koreans, which are kind of sticking to themselves, and then Japan. So Japan actually extends its 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 4 large islands that make up Japan, and it's an archipelago, meaning that it's a group or chain of islands. It lacks a lot of natural resources, which is going to end up, we know, being a big motivator in World War II as they become a huge empire. So Japan had an emperor at this time period, but the real ruler was the shogun. And I like to call the shogun the Mac Daddy samurai. And they also closed their country off to foreigners because they feared foreign influence until the America's naval fleet came in, and then they began to trade. So some important maps in history to consider as we're connecting this all through geography. We have the triangular trade route, which started in Europe. So Europe traded raw materials. Europe traded manufactured goods. Europe traded manufactured goods with Africa, like rum and guns. And then Africa, across the Middle Passage, traded slaves. And the majority of slaves went to the Caribbean. And then the Americas traded raw materials like lumber and cotton and tobacco to Europe. So then the manufactured goods, the slaves, to work those labor-intensive crops like sugarcane and tobacco, then traded back to Europe, and so on. You might also see a map with the Columbian Exchange. Remember, Columbian Exchange is just between the Americas and Europe. Africa is not part of the Columbian Exchange. So they like to give you maps that are comparisons so you can see big changes. So remember that Napoleon, after the end of the French Revolution, tries to take over all of Europe. And you look, this is Napoleon's empire. It's significant. Even though he didn't control every single one of these countries, some of these countries, so he controlled France, and then these light-colored area here, but all these others were allied with him. And so when he decides to attack Russia, that's his ultimate failing. And then at the Congress of Vienna, they decide what to do. And so at the Congress of Vienna, they basically cut back France, and so then you only see this part of France here. So this is kind of a map comparing those two things as an event. Notice, there's still no Germany on this map, so therefore this still has to be prior to World War I. So World War I is going to change the landscape of Europe. So remember that Germany, after the end of World War I, is forced to lose a lot of land, and they lose a lot of land. They lose this whole part here, which becomes Poland. Russia also loses land. They create new countries up here as well, not to mention breaking up the Austrian-Hungary Empire, creating Czechoslovakia, Austria-Hungary, Yugoslavia. So we talked about how a lot of different countries were created after World War I. And these countries were created because they feared how big Germany and Austria-Hungary had become. Remember that The German Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire all end at the end of World War One. After World War II, we're going to see a big divide across Europe. And so what is happening is here, you see this dark line, this Iron Curtain, because all this side, for the most part, are linked to the United States. They're part of NATO. And this side is linked to the Soviet Union, and they're part of the Warsaw Pact. Winston Churchill talks about this Iron Curtain that's been drawn across Europe, the communist countries versus capitalist democracy. And notice that even Germany is divided. That's going to tell us if we're Cold War, then Germany is divided. Then Germany itself, let's zoom into Germany. Well, before we do that, this is a political cartoon that kind of gives you the sense here of Stalin. Look at that wicked mustache there. How here's the Iron Curtain, right? And he's wanting to protect and keep all of that. So Germany itself was divided. Here's Germany. So this is the Soviet part. That would be East Germany, and then West Germany, the British, the French, and the Americans, they united all their part. Then remember that Berlin itself, the city, was divided here. Don't forget that African imperialism could show up as well. Remember that most of Africa was controlled by Europeans. Remember, only Ethiopia and Liberia were independent in 1914. Eventually, Egypt, then South Africa will gain their independence. Some of these countries have to fight really hard. Like, for example, Algeria here, it's a very bloody fight to get independence from France. So much so that when Morocco wants independence, France is like, yeah, just have it. And so some of them were peaceful transitions, like Ghana here was a very peaceful transition. Nigeria was as well. But it didn't always happen to be peaceful. So Algeria is a great example of a country that had to fight really hard to get their independence. So any of these would be fair game kind of questions. They love to give you maps. You're going to see lots of maps on the test.